What if the woman your husband left you for turned out to be someone who would save your life, while the mother-in-law who always hated you discovered a secret so devastating it would shatter everything she believed about her own son? This is a story about betrayal that led to the most unexpected miracle, and if you stay until the end, you'll discover why sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the doorway to your greatest blessing. So make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this one will leave you speechless, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss another incredible true story that proves life is stranger and more beautiful than fiction. Story: My husband abandoned me. I remember standing in the doorway of our bedroom watching Michael pack his suitcase with the kind of methodical precision he usually reserved for his business trips, and my hands were trembling as I asked him for the third time if he was really leaving, and he didn't even look up at me, just kept folding his shirts into perfect rectangles and placing them in neat rows, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so calm, so detached, like he was discussing the weather, and he said, "Yes, Sarah, I'm leaving and I'm not coming back," and I felt my knees buckle, but I forced myself to stay standing, forced myself to breathe even though every breath felt like swallowing glass, and I asked him why, and that's when he finally looked at me with those green eyes that I'd fallen in love with 10 years ago, except now they were cold and distant, like looking at a stranger, and he said, "Because I'm in love with someone else, and I've been in love with her for 2 years, and I can't pretend anymore." And the room started spinning, and I grabbed the door frame to steady myself, and I heard myself asking who, and he said, "Her name is Rebecca, and she understands me in ways you never could, and she makes me feel alive, and you make me feel trapped." And each word was like a physical blow, and I wanted to scream or cry or hit him, but instead I just stood there frozen as he zipped up his suitcase and walked past me, and the last thing he said before he walked out the door was, "I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce," and then he was gone, and I was alone in the house we'd bought together 5 years ago, the house where we'd planned to raise children and grow old together, and I collapsed on the floor and finally let myself cry until I had no tears left, and that's when I heard the doorbell ring, and I thought maybe he'd come back, maybe he'd realized what a terrible mistake he was making, but when I opened the door, it was Margaret, his mother, standing there with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and her designer handbag, and the moment she saw my tear-stained face, she pushed past me into the house and demanded to know where Michael was, and I told her he left me and he's in love with another woman, and I watched as her face went from confusion to disbelief to rage, and she said, "That's impossible, my son would never do such a thing, you must have driven him away," and I felt something break inside me, because even now, even after everything, she was blaming me just like she'd always blamed me for not being good enough for her precious son. And I said, "Margaret, he told me himself, and he's been having an affair for 2 years," and she raised her hand like she was going to slap me, but then she froze and her face went completely white, and she stumbled backward and sat down hard on the couch, and I thought she was having a heart attack, and I started to call 911, but she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and said, "2 years," and I nodded, and she said, "Oh my God," and her voice was barely a whisper, and then she started laughing, this horrible bitter laugh that made my skin crawl, and she said, "Of course it all makes sense now," and I had no idea what she was talking about, but she just kept laughing and crying at the same time, and finally she looked at me with something that might have been sympathy or maybe just exhaustion, and she said, "Sarah, there's something you need to know about my son," and I sat down next to her, and she told me that 2 years ago Michael had come to her asking for money, a lot of money, and he said it was for a business investment, but she'd had her accountant look into it and discovered he was lying, and the money was going to someone named Rebecca Morrison, and she'd hired a private investigator and found out that Rebecca was a woman he'd met at a conference, and Margaret had confronted Michael and threatened to tell me everything unless he ended it, and he'd promised her he would, and she'd believed him, and she'd kept his secret because she didn't want to destroy our marriage, and she didn't want me to take him for everything in the divorce, and now she realized he'd never ended it at all, he'd just gotten better at hiding it, and she started crying again, real tears this time, and she said, "I'm so sorry, Sarah, I should have told you, and I should have known he wouldn't keep his word, and I didn't know what to feel, because part of me was furious that she'd known and kept it from me, but another part of me understood that she was trying to protect her son the way mothers do even when their children don't deserve protection." And we sat there together for a long time, not saying anything, just existing in our shared grief and betrayal, and finally Margaret stood up and said, "I'm going to make this right," and I asked her what she meant, and she said, "Michael took money from the family trust, money that wasn't his to take, and if he wants to run off with his mistress he can do it without a penny from me," and she pulled out her phone and made a call call and I heard her speaking to her lawyer in that crisp authoritative tone she used when she meant business, and when she hung up she turned to me and said, I'm cutting him out of my will and I'm making sure he doesn't get anything from the trust, and whatever you get in the divorce I'll match it. And I started to protest because I didn't want her money, I just wanted my husband back, but she held up her hand and said, please let me do this, it's the least I can do after I failed you so badly. And I nodded because I was too tired to argue, and she left and I was alone again in the silent house. And that's when I noticed the envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written on it in Michael's handwriting, and I opened it with shaking hands, and inside was a short note that said, Sarah, I know you won't understand this now, but someday you'll realize I'm doing you a favor by leaving. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved, and I'm not that person, I never was. And I crumpled up the note and threw it across the room, because how dare he act like he was doing me some kind of noble service by abandoning me for another woman. And I spent the next 3 days in bed, barely eating, barely sleeping, just replaying every moment of our marriage, trying to figure out where it had gone wrong. And on the 4th day my best friend Jessica showed up and literally dragged me out of bed and into the shower and made me eat something, and she said, you need to get out of this house. And I said, I can't. And she said, yes you can and you will. And she drove me to her place and I stayed with her for a week, and slowly I started to feel human again. And that's when I got the call from Margaret, and her voice sounded strange, tight and frightened, and she said, Sarah, you need to come to the hospital right now. And I said, what happened? And she said, it's Michael and Rebecca, they were in a car accident. And my heart stopped. Because even after everything I still loved him and I couldn't bear the thought of him being hurt. And I drove to the hospital with Jessica, and when I got there Margaret was in the waiting room, and she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past week, and she said, Michael is in surgery and Rebecca is dead. And I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, because as much as I hated Rebecca for what she'd done, I never wanted her to die. And Margaret said, the doctors don't know if Michael is going to make it. And we sat there for hours waiting, and finally a doctor came out and said Michael was going to survive, but he had severe injuries and he was asking for me, and I didn't want to see him, but Margaret grabbed my hand and said please, and so I followed the doctor down the long white corridor to Michael's room. And when I walked in, he looked so small and broken in that hospital bed with tubes and wires coming out of him, and his eyes were closed, but when I said his name they fluttered open, and he looked at me and said Sarah, and his voice was so weak, and he said, I'm so sorry. And I said, I know. And he said, Rebecca is dead and it's my fault. And I said, it was an accident. And he shook his head and said, no you don't understand, I was driving and I was texting and I wasn't paying attention, and she's dead because of me. And he started crying, and I found myself reaching for his hand even though I'd sworn I'd never touch him again. And he said, I've destroyed everything and I don't deserve to live. And I said, don't say that. And he said, why do you even care after what I did to you? And I didn't have an answer because I didn't know why I cared, I just did. And I sat with him until he fell asleep, and then I went back to the waiting room, and Margaret said, thank you for going in there. And I said, I don't know why I did. And she said, because you're a better person than either of us deserve. And over the next few weeks I found myself going back to the hospital every day, even though I told myself I shouldn't. And Michael slowly started to recover physically, but emotionally he was destroyed, and he was consumed with guilt over Rebecca's death. And one day he said to me, I understand now what I threw away. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you Sarah, I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was selfish and stupid, and I thought the grass was greener but it wasn't, and now I've lost everything. And I wanted to feel vindicated, but instead I just felt sad. And I said, Michael, the first can't fix this for you. And he said, I know, and I'm not asking you to, I just want you to know that I'm sorry and that I finally understand what real love is, and it's what you gave me every single day, and I never appreciated it. And I left that day thinking that would be the last time I saw him, but the next morning I got a call from Margaret, and she said, Sarah, you need to come to the hospital right now, something's happened. And I rushed there thinking Michael had taken a turn for the worse, but when I got to his room he was sitting up in bed, and there was a woman I'd never seen before standing next to Margaret. And Michael said, Sarah, this is Dr. Chen, she's a neurologist and I don't understand what's happening. And Dr. Chen said with a kind smile, I've been studying Michael's case and I noticed some anomalies in his brain scans, and I asked him some questions and did some tests, and I've discovered something quite extraordinary. And I said, what? And she said, Michael has a brain tumor and it's been there for at least 3 years, maybe longer. And I felt my legs go weak, and I said, is he going to die? And she said, no, actually we caught it early and it's operable, but that's not the extraordinary part. And Michael said, tell her. And Dr. Chen said, this type of tumor can cause significant personality changes. Decreased empathy, increased impulsivity, poor decision making, and she looked at me meaningfully and said basically everything Michael has done in the past 2 to 3 years may not have been entirely within his control, and the room started spinning and I said, "What are you saying?" And she said, "I'm saying that the Michael you married and the Michael who left you may be two very different people." And I looked at Michael and he was crying and he said, "Sarah, I'm not making excuses for what I did, but Dr. Chen thinks the tumor affected my frontal lobe and that's why I became someone I didn't recognize." And I said, "I don't understand." And Margaret said, "Sarah, what she's saying is that my son was sick and we didn't know it." And I felt tears running down my face because I didn't know if this made things better or worse. And Dr. Chen said, "I want to operate as soon as possible, and after the surgery and recovery Michael may return to being more like his old self, but there are no guarantees." And I said, "Does he want me here?" And Michael said, "More than anything, but I understand if you can't." And I didn't answer because I didn't know what I wanted, and I left the hospital and drove around for hours trying to process everything. And finally I called Jessica and told her everything, and she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Do you still love him?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Sarah, you need to figure out what you want, not what anyone else wants." And I realized she was right, and I spent the next week thinking and praying and trying to understand my own heart. And the day before Michael's surgery I went to the hospital and I said, "I'll be here when you wake up." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because even after everything you're still my husband and I made a vow and I don't break my vows." And he said, "I don't deserve you." And I said, "No you don't, but maybe that's not the point." And the surgery was supposed to take 6 hours, but it ended up taking 9. And Margaret and I waited together and we talked more than we ever had before, and she told me about Michael as a boy, how sweet and kind he'd been and how he'd changed over the past few years, and she'd thought it was just stress from work or a midlife crisis, but now she wondered if it had been the tumor all along. And finally Dr. Chen came out and said the surgery went well and we removed the entire tumor, and now we wait and see. And over the next few weeks Michael recovered slowly and I visited him every day, and gradually I started to see glimpses of the man I'd married, the way he smiled at me when I walked in the room, the way he asked about my day and actually listened, the way he held my hand, and I could feel that he meant it. And one day about 2 months after the surgery he said, "Sarah, I remember everything I did and I have to live with that for the rest of my life, and I know the tumor affected my judgment, but it didn't make me a different person, it just removed the filters that kept my worst impulses in check, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserved all along." And I said, "Michael, the first don't know if we can go back." And he said, "I don't want to go back, I want to go forward and I want to earn your trust again, and I know it might take years or it might never happen, but I'm willing to try if you are." And I looked at this man who had broken my heart and destroyed our life together, and I saw that he was genuinely remorseful and changed, and I said, "I need time." And he said, "Take all the time you need." And so I did, and over the next year Michael went to therapy and I went to therapy and we went to couples therapy, and slowly, painfully, we started to rebuild something new. And it wasn't the same as what we'd had before because that was gone forever, but it was something real and honest and hard-earned. And Margaret became my biggest supporter, and she said, "Sarah, I've never seen Michael work so hard for anything in his life, and I think you're the making of him." And I said, "I'm not trying to make him into anything, I'm just trying to figure out if I can trust him again." And she said, "Trust isn't given, it's earned, and he's earning it every day." And one day about 18 months after Michael left me I woke up and realized that I'd forgiven him, not because he deserved it but because I deserved to be free from the anger and resentment. And we were sitting in our backyard, the same house where he'd left me, and I said, "Michael, the first forgive you." And he started crying and said, "Thank you." And I said, "But I need you to know that if you ever hurt me like that again there won't be a second chance." And he said, "I know, and I will never take you for granted again." And he's kept that promise, and it's been 3 years now since the surgery and we've renewed our vows. And Margaret was there crying tears of joy, and she said, "Sarah, you saved my son's life." And I said, "No, he saved his own life, I just gave him the chance." And she hugged me tight and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on him." And the truth is there were so many times I wanted to give up when it would have been easier to walk away and start over with someone new, but something kept me there. Maybe it was love, or maybe it was faith, or maybe it was just stubbornness, but I stayed and I fought for us, and now we have something stronger than what we had before because it's been tested by fire and survived. And people ask me how I could take him back after what he did, and I tell them it's complicated and it's not a decision anyone else can make for you, but for me I looked at the whole person, not just the worst thing he'd ever done, and I saw someone who was genuinely sorry and willing to do the work to change, and that was enough tough and sometimes I still have bad days when I remember the pain and I wonder if I made the right choice, but then Michael will do something sweet or thoughtful or he'll look at me with such love and gratitude and I know that we were given a second chance and we're not wasting it, and Margaret and I have become close in a way I never expected, and she told me recently that watching us rebuild our marriage taught her about grace and forgiveness, and she said, Sarah, I was so wrong about you and I'm sorry for all the years I didn't see what an incredible woman you are, and I said we all have blind spots and what matters is that we grow, and she nodded and said Michael is lucky to have you, and I said no, we're lucky to have each other, and that's the truth because this journey has taught me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every single day, and sometimes the choice is hard and painful but it's worth it, and the tumor that almost destroyed us ended up being the thing that saved us because it forced us to confront who we really were and who we wanted to be, and now Michael volunteers at a brain tumor support group and he tells his story to help other people understand that personality changes can be a symptom of serious illness, and he's helping people get the medical attention they need before it's too late, and I'm proud of him for turning his pain into purpose. And as for me, I've learned that I'm stronger than I ever knew, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing not to let the past define your future, and every morning I wake up grateful for the chance to write a new chapter in our story, and I know that not everyone would make the choice I made, and that's okay because everyone's journey is different, but for me this was the right path and I don't regret it. And when people ask me what I would tell someone going through something similar, I say listen to your heart, trust your gut, and know that you deserve love and respect, and if someone can't give you those things then it's okay to walk away, but if they're genuinely trying to change and they're doing the work and you still love them, then maybe it's worth fighting for, and that's all any of us can do, fight for the things and people we love and hope that it's enough, and in our case it was more than enough, it was a miracle. Subscribe message. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button right now because we share incredible true stories about love, betrayal, forgiveness, and miracles every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Sarah's situation. Would you have stayed or would you have walked away? I read every single comment and your stories inspire me, so let's keep this conversation going, and remember, sometimes the darkest moments lead to the most beautiful transformations.